Dr. James Randall is Professor Emeritus of English and African American Studies at Coe College. For more than 4 decades, Dr. Randall taught African American, English, Caribbean literature, and African American history. Born in North Carolina, Randall grew up working in the fields and witnessing segregation firsthand. He participated in sit-in demonstrations in Wilmington, North Carolina, and other events to secure the civil rights of blacks, and indeed all Americans. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. James Randall.
Well, thank you. And thank you for coming out this afternoon. I was giving a bit of thought to some of the notations that I associate with Martin Luther King Jr. that my life touched in some ways, some small ways. I never met Martin Luther King Jr. and I was never in his presence, literally. But like many people, and I'm thinking like many of you, I think my life has been touched by his spiritually and by some other means as well. One of these early touchings, I'm thinking, appeared when Martin Luther King Jr. first came into my conscious, similarly as into the consciousness of many other people as well. And this has to do, of course, with the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott actions. Primarily through my father's prompting. My father was very much interested, like many people, of course, in news events of that day, especially as they affected civil rights and civil rights activities. My hometown was a very small town in southeastern North Carolina, about 30 miles in from the Atlantic Ocean, about 20 miles up from the South Carolina border, and the far southeastern tip of the state. It is near a geographical area that is known as the Green Swamp. The Green Swamp of North Carolina. There's also a Green Swamp of Florida, but this is the North Carolina Green Swamp. We didn't actually live literally in the swamp, but we did live on the outskirts of it in a way. And today there are historical markers and a good deal of pride identifying that area, the Green Swamp, in many positive ways. When I was growing up there, the population was around 500 people in the town environs. It was largely an agricultural community, so there was lots of farm work to be done on a small basis for my own family, but during the summers especially, I did spend a lot of time working on some of the larger farms, especially tobacco farms. And this is the way that many people, many teenagers earn their livings. I suppose I could compare it somewhat to the activity of corn detasseling in Iowa. But there was, of course, the harvesting of tobacco, cultivation of it and harvesting of it in many ways. But one of the big news events of that time, of course, was the Montgomery bus boycott and becoming aware of things that were happening there. And then, of course, thinking of how that affected so many people, affected, of course, not only African Americans, but the nation as a whole. And by that time, of course, with the international focus on a good deal of media over the globe, drew a number of other people's attention as well. And out of that activity, of course, emerged the voice and the actions and a good deal of the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., along with a number of others who participated in that campaign as well. About 5 years later, in 1960, another event took place, this time in North Carolina, that drew a good deal of my attention. In part, it was spurred by some of the activities that had taken place during the Montgomery bus boycott, but also by a number of other events and actions as well. And this was the awakening of the sit-in movement that began its current phase then in Greensboro, North Carolina, at North Carolina A&T College, it was called then. I was a junior in high school when that activity began. Later, a couple of years later, I would go on to attend North Carolina A&T College. It was one of the traditional all-black institutions in North Carolina, which there were a number. At that time, North Carolina had a sort of a tripartite educational system, one for whites, one for blacks, and one for Native Americans. There was even a college, Pembroke College was for Native Americans at that time. But the sit-ins began in the city of Greensboro, participated in initially by the four freshmen, North Carolina A&T freshman students at the time. Today there are many historical markers there, and even museum markers, and even statues of some of that activity that occurred. But the sit-in movement then spread across the state and across the South from that time, even to my little hometown, which didn't have any movie theaters, didn't have any restaurants, and didn't have many places of public accommodations there. However, we did a good deal of our shopping in the town of Wilmington, North Carolina, which was located 30 miles away. And so we decided that we would join with some of the people from that community in sitting in and Mao demonstrations at the time. And so we joined with them, and on Saturdays we would be driven to Wilmington, getting our local transportation from some of the people of our town, and we would go there and we would sit in at the lunch counters at some of the variety stores, so-called 5 and dime stores in Wilmington at that time. And we did. And we, of course, had a number of experiences from that activity of sitting in. But we felt that it was something that we could do, even in a small way, to join with a good deal of the activity that was taking place in other locales. And I associate that activity with being inspired, again, by some of the things that Martin Luther King Jr. and many others were participating in at that time. When I would go on a couple of years later to become a student at North Carolina A&T College, today it's North Carolina A&T State University, activities were still taking place. Marches were being engaged in. Movie theaters were still segregated. Restaurants were still segregated. And so the large number of the student body as a whole, including the faculty, at least a number of faculty, participating in some of those demonstrations as well. And things were happening, of course, on a larger scale in other places. So that sit-in movement was inspired in part, again, by some of the activities that Martin Luther King Jr. and others had begun in Montgomery and other places as well. In 1963, of course, a year that many of us can identify with, occurred the March on Washington, and a number of students from my college participated in it. as did a number of students from other colleges, and just many regular citizens from many places participated in that as well. 1968, of course, many of us remember as being the year of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. And that also touched, of course, many of our lives indirectly and many directly as well. By that time, I was a graduate student at Indiana University in Bloomington, in Indiana. And again, it's a memorable event. We remember many memorable events. Many of you who can associate with the assassination of President Kennedy, for example, or other momentous events that take place at various times as well. And so we still have some fresh or relatively fresh memories of occasions that occurred. In the 1970s and 1980s, by this time I was teaching here in Iowa at Coe College in Cedar Rapids. And it gave me the opportunity to at least introduce some of my students to some of the events associated with Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. At that time we had a special calendar at Coe called the 414 calendar, in which students would take one course, 4 courses in the fall, 4 in the spring. And in the month of January, they would take a so-called exploratory course. And one of the exploratory courses that I offered was a course dealing with Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And we would study some of their works and some of their activities. By that time, we had a growing amount of documentary, video material, and also audio material that we would weave into that course as well. I would not teach it every January, but maybe every second, every third January, sort of intermix it with other kinds of courses dealing with some aspect of African American life and culture. But that was a course that many of the students grew to enjoy and grew to draw some inspiration from as well. In 1986, of course, was a year in which Martin Luther King's birthday became a national holiday. And so that is another reminder that we are still very much associated with. And of course, it is being commemorated on this particular day here today. And afterwards, aspects in Martin Luther King's life and experience that remain with us, that are ever present. We just heard some of the notations of his words that we can recognize and that we can be sort of ever associated with in ways as well. In this year, 2013, one of the African American historical organizations, the Association for the Study of African American History and Culture, is giving a special marking of 2013. It happens, of course, to be the 50th anniversary coming this August of the March on Washington. And some scholarly attention will be devoted to that event at the annual meeting of the Association for the Study of African American Life and Culture, when its meeting will occur in the fall. But it's also noted that this year, 2013, is also the 150th anniversary of the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation. The event that began to free slavery, which was actually done as a whole in 1865 with the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. But especially in 1863, we began to get some activity that would spur the realization of that event as well. And as I was thinking of all other historical markers that did occur a very interesting historical marker in 1913 even, on the 50th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. One of the writers and civil rights leaders, James Weldon Johnson, some of you will recognize one of his works. He is the author of the poem "Lift Every Voice and Sing," which has become something of a sort of an unofficial African-American anthem, and it's sung and presented on numerous occasions. In 1913, he published a poem called 50 Years, and it was the 50th year since the Emancipation Proclamation. And that poem, of course, pays tribute to Abraham Lincoln and to a number of other abolitionists and civil people who led the struggle for civil rights and freedoms. Black Americans, white Americans, many who did have something to do with the abolition of slavery. And of course, in that year, 1913, James Weldon Johnson wondered when that struggle would become more complete. And in 1963, it still, of course, had not been complete. And so the March on Washington was chosen to be an event in 1963 because it represented the 100th year of the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. So there was still work to be done. And now, of course, we are in 2013, 50 years beyond that. And so we still bring some attention to things that have been done, and a great number of positive things have been done. But we also reminded that there's still a good deal of work to be done in general in the society as well. So, 70 years ago, and most of you will recognize the echo there and use the term score. And of course we remember, have become acquainted with Abraham Lincoln's famous introduction to one of his greatest speeches, greatest deliveries. But 70 years ago, in 1863, was issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which proclaimed the freedom of slaves who were held in rebel areas, or who were held by people who were in rebellion against the United States. It did not abolish slavery completely, but technically, by those who were in rebellion against the United States, leading to the 1865 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which would abolish slavery. And we are reminded, of course, as Director Swartz could tell us, and I guess chapter and verse, a number of attentions given to Abraham Lincoln, hundreds and hundreds of books written about him. Now documentaries, a number of those available, and currently the very popular motion picture movie on Lincoln's life as well. And of course, some of this, of course, is very much attached to events dealing with African American life and African American faith, as well as it is, of course, to the nation at large, in some aspects to the globe at large. And 50 years ago, 1913, hundreds, 50 years ago, 1913, James Weldon Johnson's poem, 50 Years. A poem looking at events that had taken place 50 years since slavery, of course, had been abolished. And then 10 years ago, 1963, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom occurred August 28th of that year. And again, this was the year chosen for the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Freedom had still not been acquired in enough also the occasion of Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous I Have a Dream speech, which we recognize pretty readily. But very soon, in 1964, followed the Civil Rights Bill, and in 1965, the Voting Rights Act, which brought democracy more of a reality in our nation, in our country, in which some freedoms and privileges were. Democracy becomes a fact in 1965 because a number of people, thousands of people who had not been allowed to vote by various shenanigans then could vote directly. And we see monumental political profile being changed not only in the North but in many places in the South as well. Suddenly people can run for office, they can be elected, they can participate directly in democratic action and democratic activity. And today, 150 years, we are at 150 years after the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation, the 148th year after the abolition of slavery in the United States, 50 years after the March on Washington, 49 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, 48 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, 27 years after Martin Luther King's birthday has become a national holiday. And today, the first United States president of African American lineage is inaugurated for a second term. Martin Luther King Jr.'s memory has been woven through the inaugural events taking place this day, this week. President Obama, for example, was sworn in holding a Bible that was once used by Martin Luther King Jr. So we can see the shadow of Martin Luther King very much present there as well. And on Friday of last week, the White House released a proclamation from President Obama in which he seemed to connect a key idea from his first campaign, change, with Martin Luther King Jr. and his activities that also emphasized change as well. President Obama's proclamation quoted Martin Luther King as saying, "Change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle." So our jobs, of course, have quite a way to continue to go. So each year, each day can note significant events of various measures by the thousands of people, by few people, and by the individuals, as well. Like Martin Luther King Jr., James Weldon Johnson also saw the great need for these events to occur. And I will give you just a short note on James Weldon Johnson, the author of that 1913 poem, 50 Years. James Weldon Johnson, who lived from 1871 to 1938, was an African-American author, politician, diplomat. He was ambassador to Nicaragua and to Guatemala, I think, back in the earlier years, in the 19-teens. He was a journalist, a poet, an anthologist, an educator, a lawyer, a songwriter, an early civil rights activist. He is remembered best for his leadership within the NAACP, as well as for his writing, which includes novels, poems, collections of folklore. He was also one of the first African-American professors at New York University. And later in life, he was a professor of creative literature and writing at Fisk University, the traditionally African-American university in Tennessee. We also, as we think of Martin Luther King's contributions, his activities, and even with some of his references to Abraham Lincoln, and maybe even some association with Abraham Lincoln, among many African Americans, and also by others as well. Abraham Lincoln is sometimes viewed as the great emancipator, known as the great emancipator, called the great emancipator. But I think that Martin Luther King Jr. and others can be seen as emancipators as well. Maybe slightly different kinds of emancipators, but emancipators. One of the things that they did was to spur us to become more of a real democracy. The United States would become more of a real democracy. Sometimes you would see quips made by some others that at one time we were, maybe more closer than we are willing to say, a pigmentocracy. But today we can recognize being more of a real democracy. And yes, many of us were small d Democrats, and many of us were already expansive in our actions and beliefs in many ways. But yet, still, as a country, we did continue to give aid and support to the lawful oppressive treatments of people in some areas and in some practices of our country, whether we liked it or not. Until, of course, some of the advances acquired by the passage of the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Act. We no longer had to do these things to give support to these lawful oppressive treatments of people. We no longer had to do these things by direct or indirect course. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights activists and supporters emancipated us from that course. We no longer had to give sanctions to these things, even if we differed from them in the essence of ourselves, yet they were still practiced in the society at large. But today, no longer in that manner. So King and others freed us from state and societal sponsorship of an official, biased, and also of inhumane practices, however indirect they had to be. Just think how much the country has opened up to educational opportunities, to employment opportunities. Even civic and entertainment venues have also spread, including sports and athletic participation. For example, today, and for a long time now, we think of the South could field professional sports teams. Before the Civil Rights Bill was passed, southern areas could not have professional sports teams because of the segregation connection in that way. But today, that is just one example. There are many other more, of course, important examples that are more broadly based. Political participation, participating actively in politics and political action, representatives in Congress, and also in other areas as well, with openings occurring there. One of the things that we still note are the effects of Martin Luther King Jr.'s words, and in addition to having them in print, there are still available recordings of Martin Luther King Jr. on audio recordings and also video recordings that we have access to as well. But I will share with you a few of his sayings and words, some of which you are familiar with in ways that are noteworthy and memorable. On one occasion he said, for example, that we must concentrate not merely on the negative expulsion of war, but the positive affirmation of peace. The quality, not the longevity of one's life, is what is important. Pity may represent little more than the impersonal concern which prompts the mailing of a check, but true sympathy is the personal concern which demands the giving of one's soul. The moral arc of the universe bends at the elbow of justice. I am not interested in power for power's sake, but I'm interested in power that is moral, that is right, and that is good. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. We must build dikes of courage to hold back the flood of fear. An individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest respect of the law. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. The hope of a secure and livable world lies with disciplined nonconformists who are dedicated to justice, peace, and brotherhood. Never succumb to the temptation of bitterness. If we are to go forward, we must go back and rediscover those precious values, that all reality hinges on moral foundations, and that all reality has spiritual control. Rarely do we find men who willingly engage in hard, solid thinking. There is an almost universal quest for easy answers and half-baked solutions. Nothing pains some people more than having to think. We must learn to live together as brothers, or perish together as fools. We must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word. Whatever your life's work, do it well. A person should do his job so well that the living, the dead, and the unborn could not do it better. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? The time is always right to do what is right. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. An individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individual concerns to the broader courses of all humanity. The ultimate measure of a person is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, the tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated people. We must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive. He who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love. There is some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. When we discover this, we are less prone to hate our enemies. The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. With remembrance, awareness, and recognition of Martin Luther King Jr. and of the work and contributions of many others, we heed the reverberations of bells portending various phases of righteous freedom which we seek. Let those bells ring. Pull together at the cord. Remind the land. Temper the land. Awaken the land. Receive the sound. Let us march on. Let us march on. Let us march on. On. The victory is truly won. Till we become embodiment of the dream. May we have many other occasions to commemorate the birth of a person like Martin Luther King, and the birth and contributions of many others as well. May we go on to commemorate, and may we take the occasion to find many of these embodiments in Martin Luther King Jr., who still stands as a witness to the growing good that we can participate in and that we can help to spread. Whether we do it by large numbers, whether we do it by small numbers, whether we do it by our individual exertions, but the point is to let it continue and to let it grow. Thank you.